The Countess and the Crimson Ribbon, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a crimson ribbon found in the most unexpected place. To everyone else, it seems insignificant. But Miss Marple knows that even the smallest clue can lead to murder. Before we uncover the truth behind the crimson ribbon, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Countess Wears the Crimson Ribbon. The village of Ashcombe had been quiet for so long that people had almost forgotten what real excitement felt like. Days passed with little more than church bells, fresh bread cooling on window sills, and neighbours discussing the weather as though it were the most important matter in England. Nothing ever seemed to change. That was exactly how the villagers liked it. Peace was a habit. Routine was a comfort. And strangers were noticed before they had even reached the village square. It was on a cold October afternoon that everything began to shift. Rain drifted across the fields in slow waves. The hedgerows glistened beneath a pale sky. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Children stopped chasing one another through the square. Every eye turned towards the winding road leading to Ravenshade Manor. A dark carriage appeared between the trees. It rolled forward at an unhurried pace. The horses made barely a sound upon the damp road. The driver never looked left or right. He simply guided the carriage through the center of the village as though he had traveled the route 100 times before. The carriage stopped outside the old manor gates. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. A woman stepped onto the gravel. She was tall, graceful, dressed entirely in black. Her coat reached almost to the ground. Black gloves covered her hands. A small black hat rested neatly above silver-grey hair that had been carefully arranged. She wasn't young. Yet she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. Around her neck rested a narrow crimson ribbon. Not silk. Not velvet. Just a simple ribbon tied with remarkable care. It caught the eye immediately. The color seemed almost too bright against the dull afternoon. Mrs. Wilcox, who never missed anything worth repeating, leaned closer to the baker beside her. "That's an unusual thing to wear." The baker nodded. "It certainly is." Neither of them spoke again until the carriage disappeared through the manor gates. By supper time the entire village was discussing the ribbon. Some believed it was simply old family tradition. Others insisted it marked a period of mourning. One elderly gentleman confidently declared it had something to do with ancient nobility. He had absolutely no evidence for this. Still, he sounded convincing enough for several people to believe him. Miss Marple heard every version before the evening was over. She had arrived in Ashcombe only 2 days earlier to visit her old friend, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, a cheerful widow whose cottage overlooked the village green. They had planned nothing more adventurous than quiet walks, needlework, and rather too much tea. That plan lasted precisely 48 hours. The following morning the Countess attended the village church. She arrived early, She sat alone. She sang every hymn without once looking around the room. When the service ended, she greeted the vicar politely, thanked him for his sermon, smiled warmly at several villagers. Yet each conversation ended after only a sentence or two. She seemed pleasant enough, but careful, as though she had measured every word before speaking it. Miss Marple watched quietly from the churchyard. "She seems nervous," Mrs. Finch whispered. "No." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Not nervous. Cautious. There is a difference." Outside the church, a small gust of wind swept through the yard. For the briefest moment, the Countess reached towards the crimson ribbon. Not to straighten it. Not to admire it. Simply to make certain it was still there. Her fingers remained upon it for barely a second before she lowered her hand again. Miss Marple noticed. Most people wouldn't have. That afternoon the Countess invited several ladies from the village to Ravenshade Manor for tea. It was considered the proper thing to do. New arrivals were expected to make themselves known. Curiosity alone guaranteed a full drawing room. The manor itself had always carried an uneasy reputation. It stood on a gentle rise beyond the village, built from grey stone darkened by rain and age. Tall windows overlooked sweeping gardens that had long since grown wild. Ivy climbed the walls without permission. The old oak trees surrounding the house seemed determined to keep every secret locked behind their branches. Inside, everything appeared perfectly arranged. Silver gleamed upon polished tables. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases. The fire burned brightly. The Countess welcomed each guest with quiet kindness. She remembered every name after hearing it only once. She asked thoughtful questions. She laughed softly at the right moments. Yet something about the afternoon never quite settled. Whenever conversation drifted towards Ravenshade Manor's history, the Countess gently changed the subject. Whenever someone mentioned her late husband, she smiled politely, then reached for her teacup before anyone could ask another question. And whenever anyone glanced at the crimson ribbon, she noticed. Every single time. Mrs. Wilcox finally gathered enough courage to ask, "My dear Countess, forgive my curiosity, but your ribbon is rather striking." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed quieter. The Countess smiled. "It reminds me never to forget." Her answer sounded pleasant enough. Yet it explained nothing. Nobody wished to appear rude. So the conversation moved elsewhere. Only Miss Marple remained thoughtful. People often avoided answering questions, but they rarely chose their words by accident. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked slowly through the manor gardens before returning to the village. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. Crows circled above the trees. As she passed an old stone bench, she noticed something lying beneath it. A length of faded crimson ribbon, older than the one worn by the Countess. Its color had almost disappeared. Miss Marple bent down and picked it up. The ends had been cut cleanly, not torn. "Cat," She turned it over thoughtfully before slipping it into her coat pocket. At that very moment, she became aware of someone watching her. She looked towards the upper windows of Ravenshade Manor. The Countess stood behind the glass, perfectly still. Their eyes met. For just a second. Then the curtain drifted closed. Miss Marple continued down the path without a word. The ribbon, she murmured to herself. It's far older than the woman wearing it. She had come to Ashcombe expecting nothing more than a peaceful holiday. Instead, before the week had properly begun, she was already holding the first clue to a mystery that someone had spent many years trying to keep buried. Chapter 2. The Shadow Inside Ravenshade Manor. The following morning the village woke beneath a blanket of thick mist. The fields had almost disappeared. Even the church tower looked distant. Ashcombe seemed quieter than usual, as though the whole village had decided to whisper. Miss Marple was finishing her breakfast when hurried footsteps stopped outside the cottage. Mrs. Finch opened the front door. The village postman stood there. His face had lost all colour. "There's been trouble at Ravenshade Manor," he said. "The Countess has been found." Neither woman asked another question. They were already reaching for their coats. The road to the manor was crowded by the time they arrived. Villagers stood behind the iron gates. Nobody spoke above a whisper. They simply watched. Faces pale with curiosity. And something else. Fear. Inside the manor the atmosphere felt different. The warmth from the previous afternoon had vanished. The fires had burned low. The curtains remained closed. Every servant moved quietly, eyes lowered. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. The Countess had been found in the library. She sat in a high-backed chair beside the fireplace. One hand rested upon an open book. The other lay across her lap. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful. There wasn't a single wound. No sign of a struggle. Nothing broken. Nothing disturbed. The village doctor removed his spectacles and sighed. "She passed away several hours ago." The inspector frowned. "But from what?" The doctor slowly shook his head. "I can't say." "Not yet." The inspector disliked mysteries that offered no obvious answers. He walked around the room several times, looking at the windows, the fireplace, the shelves, the carpet. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. The doors were locked, one servant explained. The windows were bolted. No one entered. No one left. The inspector rubbed his forehead. "So we have a dead countess inside a locked room." He looked towards Miss Marple. "I suppose you find that interesting." Miss Marple smiled politely. "I rarely find death interesting. The people around it usually are." The inspector gave a quiet sigh. He had heard remarks like that before. They rarely made his day easier. One by one the servants gave their statements. The butler claimed he had locked the front door shortly after 10. The cook said the Countess had refused supper. The housemaid admitted she had taken a tray upstairs anyway. It was untouched this morning, she whispered. The tea had gone cold. The bread had dried. I don't think she ate anything. Miss Marple listened without interrupting. People often revealed more when nobody hurried them. The gardener remembered seeing a light burning in the library after midnight. The footman insisted every light had been out before he retired. Someone was mistaken. Or someone was lying. Miss Marple slowly wandered around the library while the inspector questioned the servants again. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Portraits stared down from dark wooden panels. The grandfather clock ticked steadily. Nothing appeared unusual. Until she stopped beside one of the bookcases. A single shelf caught her attention. Every book stood perfectly straight. Except for one small gap. The dust told the story. Something had been removed recently. Miss Marple reached out and brushed a finger across the polished wood. The clean space stood out immediately. A book is missing, she said. The inspector glanced towards the shelf. Perhaps the Countess was reading it. Miss Marple gently shook her head. If she had been, there would be dust missing from the books beside it. There isn't. The inspector stepped closer. For the first time that morning, he looked uncertain. Later that afternoon the servants finished searching every room. Nothing appeared. The missing book had simply vanished. The inspector became increasingly irritated. He disliked disappearing objects almost as much as impossible deaths. As evening settled over Ravenshade Manor, the rain returned. The windows rattled softly. Thunder rolled somewhere across the hills. Miss Marple remained in the library. She wasn't looking at the books anymore. She was studying the portraits. Most showed members of the Harcourt family. Proud faces. Fine clothes. Serious expressions. Then she stopped. One portrait had been painted many years before. It showed a young woman dressed in plain black. She wasn't a lady of the house. She looked more like a housekeeper. Around her neck rested a narrow crimson ribbon. Exactly like the one the Countess had worn. Miss Marple stepped closer. The paint had faded with age. The ribbon had not. Behind her the library door opened. The butler entered carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I found this outside the study door," he said quietly. The inspector opened it. Inside was the missing book. No one had seen who left it there. Tucked between the pages was a folded piece of paper. The inspector unfolded it carefully. Only 7 words had been written across the page. The ribbon never belonged to the Countess. Silence filled the room. The inspector stared at the message. Miss Marple did not. Her eyes were still fixed upon the portrait. Very softly she spoke. "The wrong woman has been carrying the right secret. Outside. Somewhere beyond the rain." A heavy gate creaked open. No one had gone near it. Chapter 3. The truth behind the crimson ribbon. The rain stopped before dawn. A thin layer of mist drifted across the gardens of Ravenshade Manor. The village was awake long before sunrise. Nobody spoke about anything except the Countess. Every cottage held a different story. Every neighbor had a different theory. The inspector had spent the entire night searching the manor. He had found nothing that explained how the Countess had died. Nothing except the strange note and the missing book that had somehow returned. Miss Marple arrived at the manor shortly after breakfast. She walked through the front gate without hurry. The inspector was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked tired. His collar was crooked. His notebook was full. His patience was almost gone. "I've questioned every servant twice," he said. "I've searched every room. I've checked every lock. Nothing fits." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That usually means someone has worked very hard to make everything fit." The inspector frowned. "You already know something, don't you?" "I know enough to ask the right question." She walked straight to the library. The portrait of the young woman still hung above the fireplace. The crimson ribbon around her neck looked almost new despite the age of the painting. Miss Marple stood in silence for several moments. Then she asked the butler a simple question. "Who is the woman in the portrait?" The old butler hesitated. "Her name was Margaret Ellis. She worked here many years ago. Before my time. I was told she disappeared one winter. Nobody ever spoke about her again." "Disappeared," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "How convenient." The inspector folded his arms. "That doesn't prove anything." "No," Miss Marple replied. "But it explains why someone wanted this portrait forgotten." She asked to see the old household records. The butler unlocked a dusty cabinet hidden beneath the staircase. Inside were ledgers, letters, estate accounts. Most had not been touched for decades. Miss Marple carefully turned each page until one envelope slipped onto the floor. It contained a faded photograph. The inspector picked it up. The Countess stood beside another woman. They looked remarkably alike. The second woman wore the same crimson ribbon. Written neatly across the back were 6 simple words. Margaret Ellis. My beloved elder sister. The room fell silent. The inspector looked from the photograph to the portrait above the fireplace. My word, he whispered. Miss Marple nodded. The Countess didn't come here to claim the manor. She came to discover what became of her sister. The ribbon wasn't a fashion. It was a promise. The inspector stared at the photograph. Then someone in this house knew the truth. They still do. At that moment the housekeeper quietly tried to leave the room. Miss Marple turned towards her. You needn't hurry away. The woman froze. Her hands began to shake. The inspector noticed at once. Miss Marple spoke calmly. Your father was the previous groundskeeper. He witnessed what happened all those years ago. He buried the truth because he was ordered to. Before he died, he told you everything. The housekeeper lowered her head. Tears filled her eyes. "He didn't kill Margaret," she whispered. "The old master did." She discovered that he had stolen money from the estate and planned to expose him. During an argument, she fell down the cellar steps. He told everyone she had run away. My father hid the body beneath the old wine cellar. He spent the rest of his life regretting it. The inspector stood speechless. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. So the Countess found the truth. "Yes," the housekeeper replied. "She found the old records yesterday afternoon. She said she would go to the police in the morning. Someone overheard her." The inspector looked sharply towards the butler. His face had turned pale. "I only wanted the secret buried forever," the butler said quietly. "My father served the old master. If the truth came out, my family name would be ruined. I slipped poison into the Countess's evening tea before she could drink it. I thought she had already taken a cup upstairs. I never imagined she would leave it untouched until later." The library became completely silent. Outside, the church bell began to ring. The inspector stepped forward and placed the butler under arrest. Miss Marple looked once more at the portrait of Margaret Ellis. The crimson ribbon had never been a decoration. It had been a silent promise between two sisters. One had disappeared. The other had returned decades later to finish what had been left undone. As the police carriage disappeared down the long drive, Miss Marple folded the old photograph and placed it inside the family ledger. Some secrets can remain hidden for years, even generations. But the truth has remarkable patience. It waits quietly. And sooner or later, someone always opens the right door. If you enjoyed this Miss Marple mystery, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments when you realized the crimson ribbon was the real clue. There are many more mysteries waiting in quiet English villages. And the next visitor may arrive carrying a secret even darker than this one.